Dr. Mike Nevell. Mike is going to talk today about the geographical and chronological distribution of cruck buildings and types in northwest England, with an emphasis on Cheshire and Greater Manchester. He'll be using the village of Warburton and the medieval towns of Stockport and Altrincham as case studies for recording cruck-frame structures. Mike is a landscape archaeologist with more than 30 years experience working in the UK. His interests and specialisms include timber frame buildings, industrial buildings, community archaeology, and the archaeology of industrialisation. He's written dozens of books and published dozens of articles, including books and articles on timber frame buildings. He's currently the Industrial Heritage Support Officer for the whole of England and is based at the Ironbridge Gorge Museum. And he's an Honorary Research Fellow in Industrial Archaeology at Salford University, where he, in his previous position, he was head of archaeology. So, Mike, I'm going to ask you to share your screen, and somebody is still got noise in the background, so I'm going to mute a few people.
Right, can everybody see that?
Yes, great.
Oh, phew. Right, first technical issue hump got over then. Right. Right, okay, well, let's dive in. Thanks very much for inviting me to talk about cruck-frame buildings. I'm going to sort of spend the next half hour, 35 minutes, just looking at cruck-frame buildings in the northwest of England, because that's the area I know particularly well for this particular type of structure. As Doug said, I'm going to be looking at some case studies from urban environments, but also some case studies from rural environments as well. And my interest in cruck-frame buildings really comes from my time in the 1990s and 2000s, doing a lot of buildings archaeology work, not just planning related, but also research work, looking at the origins of landscapes and farms in northwest England, particularly in the sort of southern part of that region, which is Cheshire and Greater Manchester. And these buildings leap out of the landscape. They're very distinctive buildings, as you can see from the example here on my first slide. And that really sums up the dominant image of this particular timber frame building type, where you have two curved timber trusses that are tied at the top and braced. And it's a building type that is distinctive, but is also overlaps, as we'll see chronologically, with box frame buildings and aisle buildings in Britain from the sort of 12th century through to the 17th, 18th centuries. Right, let's see if I can get that to advance. Oh, did it? Yeah, there we go. So just an example of a few of the cruck frame buildings that we have in the northwest of England and the kind of context we find them in. We have a lot of cruck frame buildings that have gone, particularly on the fringes of the main urban areas of the region, places like Preston and Bolton and Liverpool and Manchester and Stockport. Had cruck frame buildings that have been lost during urbanisation in the later 19th and 20th centuries. Quite often, though, they're reused either as in a domestic location, or you can still find them occasionally in a rural agricultural location. And this is one of the cruck frame building is one of the three main types of timber frame building that we have in northern England. Box frame building is the most common. The least common is the aisled building, and the cruck frame buildings are somewhere in between. In terms of numbers, there's probably 3 or 4 times the number of box frame buildings than there are known crook frame buildings in northwest England, and that's pretty common for the area, as we'll see in a moment, where you find box frame and crook frame buildings overlapping. One of the features of the crook frame building is because you've got this sort of capital A-shaped truss, it allows you to have a very big space on one floor, and so quite often you see these buildings associated with an open hall in the centre of a building. And frequently they're 3 units to more typically 3 units long. So they're very much in that later medieval tradition of open hall, communal living, and they fit that kind of development in the 12th to the 15th centuries. These are the sort of major elements you'll find in a crook frame building, and so you can see the individual elements of the truss on the right hand side, where we have the 2 curved trusses, and then a collar and tie beam. Quite often you have a yoke at the top as well. So you end up with those 3 forms of braces, and then you get spurs to the outer walls. And what that means is that the outer walls are really quite structurally separate to these A-frame trusses, and it's the A-frame trusses that support the roof. And whilst that gives you a large volume of space in each of these rooms, it does also make it actually quite difficult, quite inflexible to add extra stories. We will see examples of buildings in a bit where the crook frame truss structure has been adapted, and the way they've added extra stories is by moving over to a box frame tradition. So whilst this building form is great for the big spaces and communal living, it's not so good when we move into the 16th and 17th centuries, when there's that shift towards more personal living, more specialised room space, and the need for extra rooms and more stories. And that's really where crook frame buildings start to fall out of fashion. The Vernacular Architecture Group, I should give a shout out for them, because they've been pulling together the data on crook frame buildings across Britain since the 1960s. Nat Alcock in particular has been leading that research for at least 40 years. They have a fantastic online database of crook frame buildings, which they took the opportunity of the pandemic and lockdown to update and turn that into a live database. And that database does 2 things. Firstly, it's got individual entries for all the crook structures that we know of in Britain. Secondly, it also records the tree-ring dated, dendrodated structures across Britain as well. So on the right hand side here, you can see what for me is one of the most extraordinary distribution maps you're ever likely to see in building studies, which is the distribution of crook frame buildings in England and Wales. You find them in Scotland, you find them in Ireland, and also on mainland Europe as well, in Northern Europe. But here in England and Wales, you can see the almost virtual absence of crook frame buildings in eastern and southeast England. We still don't know why. This is a distribution map that was first pulled together in the late 1970s. Each time we've added extra data to it, each time the Vernacular Architecture Group have added to their database, this distribution map holds good. So it's really, really peculiar, and we haven't, whilst we can talk about different styles of timber frame traditions as a regional characteristic, it is very odd that we see a complete dearth of crook frame buildings in East Anglia, Lincolnshire, Kent, East Sussex. It's very striking. On the left, you can see a distribution map of the dendrodated examples of crook buildings, dendrodated between 76 and 09. Vernacular Architecture Group have recently added another 30 or 40 examples to that list of dendrodated crook frame buildings. It doesn't change the overall pattern you see here, where we have a chronological spread of surviving structures. Doesn't mean that the crook frame buildings are start to be built in the 12th century. It just means they survived from then. So we've got from the late 12th century through to the 18th century, with 3 peaks in the mid 14th century, just before the Black Death, and then 2 peaks in the later 15th century and in the later 16th century. That's based on 369 dated examples of cruck buildings, but as I said, there's another 30 plus that they've Vernacular Architecture Group have added, and that doesn't change that pattern. What it means statistically is that there's a 66% chance if you find a building with cruck frames in it, it's going to predate 1600 in England and Wales, and probably Scotland as well. So what that means is you have a 2 in 3 chance of walking into a cruck frame building and it being at least 400 years old. And out of that dated database for cruck buildings, we've got 28 examples from northwest England which have been tree ring dated, which is quite low and something we're trying to improve. Now, researching cruck frame buildings in the northwest of England goes way back to the 1970s. First study of cruck frame buildings in a serious manner was undertaken by Marion McClintock in the Fylde Peninsula, which is the area behind Blackpool in that sort of northwestern corner of Lancashire. And here there's 35 cruck frame buildings were identified in the 70s and early 80s. Many of them were surveyed as well. And we also have a document, a local manorial document, a map of landholding from Lytham, which may well show the earliest buildings with cruck frames in them in terms of drawings in the northwest of England, which is the image in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide here. And you can see these are thatched single-storey buildings, quite often just 2 units. So we're not talking about structures that are high up the social scale on this particular map, but they are our earliest view of buildings containing cruck frames. And you can see here from a couple of these drawings how the cruck frame structures then get incorporated into the vernacular architecture locally of the 17th and 18th centuries, and the cruck framed elements of these buildings really get buried, and that's one of the stories of how cruck frame structures survive in the region. The same goes for the study of cruck frame structures in Cumbria, which runs from the 1980s through to the 2000s, and there was quite an intensive period of recording rural cruck frame buildings in northern Cumbria on the Solway Plain, which is where the arrow is pointing to, after the foot and mouth outbreak in 2000-2001, which led to lots of farm buildings having to be disinfected, and that had an impact on the local vernacular architecture, and there was a study to record those. I think it was Mike Messenger, who was the conservation officer for Carlisle, did a postgraduate thesis on this survey work that he was involved with. Lots of the cruck frame buildings in northern Cumbria are rural and agricultural based. Down at the southern part of the region, in northern Cheshire and Greater Manchester, we've been looking at cruck frame buildings since the 1990s. And one of the interesting things about Greater Manchester is that it's a largely urban area. I say largely, there are uplands to the north and the east that rise in some cases above 400 metres above sea level. There are some very significant river valleys like the River Irwell, the River Medlock and the River Mersey, which have lots of late medieval settlement along them. But we have a fair amount of urban sprawl because of industrialisation. So a lot of our cruck frame buildings in this area are buried in that urban area and buried in buildings that have been rebuilt in the 17th century and then onwards into the 19th and 20th century. What that means is we're still finding examples, sometimes fragmentary examples, of cruck frame buildings buried in an urban context. You can see here from this distribution map, we have 97 examples in Greater Manchester that we know of. We keep finding them, keep adding them to them, of which 74 are extant. And when I say extant, that may mean we've only got one truss or parts of one truss surviving in the building rather than the whole structure. But you'll see there's a distribution here to the east and south of Greater Manchester, and Altrincham and Stockport as two medieval towns are in the southern part of the county, and Warburton's in the sort of bottom left-hand corner where you can see lots of dots there. Fewer cruck-frame buildings in the more upland areas of Greater Manchester, but that's a common theme across England. Cruck-frame buildings tend not to be common in more upland areas, but you do get them in upland valleys. So just to show you two examples of urban cruck-framed structures. Urban cruck-framed structures quite clearly were, in some contexts, were more common than they are today, but they tend to be quite rare. So this is Staircase House, for instance, where the cruck-frame truss was revealed by a really quite bad fire in 1995, 1996, as being the core of a merchant's house, and then later on a gentry house. And this has a history spanning from the 1460s, which is the date of the cruck-frame building, through to the 20th century. And in the 16th and 17th century, this is a courtyard property with timber box frame buildings around it, but also some stone wings as well. And the surviving two cruck trusses, which is for a three-bay house with a central hall, is really buried in the timber framing you can see on the left here. And one of the two cruck trusses is shown drawn on the right. The reason we were able to disentangle all this, as I said, is because of the major fire in 1995. I'm glad to say this was subsequently restored in the early 2000s and is now open, owned by the council and open as a museum and heritage centre community hub. And they have the cruck-frame trusses on display, so you can come in and see the structures. But it is very typical of the way in which these cruck frames are buried within the later development of the building. And this is an example of a building that's expanded using box frame, the box frame tradition, in order to create extra floors. Actually, in this case, 2 floors, and then at the back there's a 3-floor extension. Altrincham is another of these late medieval market towns we have in northwest England, where we have examples of cruck-framed buildings. And one of the things we've got here is we've got records of demolished cruck-frame buildings around the old medieval marketplace. That's what the black and white building at the bottom rather, is doing. But we also suspect there are some cruck-frame buildings in the range of buildings at the top and on the right-hand side there. And we had an opportunity to look at one of these in late 2019 during renovation work of the range of buildings in the top left-hand corner there, particularly the buildings, the 2-storey buildings in the middle, which are sort of suspiciously low in scale. And lo and behold, inside those structures, we had fragments of internal timber frame partitions with wattle and daub, timber frame partitions sitting on sandstone sills. And in one wall, we've got this one surviving cruck truss, which you see here exposed for the first time, presumably in about 200 years, in the partition wall between number 10 and number 8 Old Marketplace in Altrincham. So again, it's quite common to find these structures in this kind of location. But for Altrincham, this range of buildings, we knew they were timber framed. We didn't suspect they were cruck framed at all. And what's interesting about this particular building from an urban point of view is that this is a building that runs across 2 burgage plots and is sort of parallel to the marketplace, rather than running back with the gable end fronting the marketplace, which is what most of the other buildings around the old marketplace do. So it's in a quite a prominent position, occupying the front of those 2 burgage plots. Most of the cruck frame buildings we've studied in northern Cheshire and Greater Manchester, though, are in a rural location. So, for instance, this is Eighthorn Fold. You will recognise that as the background to my picture. and this is actually dendrodated to the late 15th century. It's a 4-bay cruck-frame building, sadly hit by fire in the 1990s, but you're looking at one of the cruck trusses at the end of an open hall leading into the domestic rooms at the eastern end of the building, and you can see at the bottom the plan of the crux and the later stone and brick additions. And there's actually very little documentary material associated with this farmhouse. Again, that's quite normal for many of the rural buildings that have cruck structures in the region. We know that this is a freehold property that then becomes a tenanted property by the early 18th century, but we don't know precisely the status of the people who built this cruck-frame structure in the 15th century. And again, we've got fragments of timber framing in various parts of Greater Manchester, which have elements of crooks in them. So here we have the remains of a cruck-frame building used in a garage in Stockport, whereas this example in Kersal in Salford is almost a complete survival. It's probably the best surviving cruck-frame building in Greater Manchester, which was built as a monastic cell for Lenton Priory, dendrodated to 1515. It's got these two cross wings which were added in the 1550s after the Reformation. You can see here from the planned form that we've got 4 cruck trusses in the centre of this building, and then after the Reformation we've got the introduction of a first floor and 2 box frame wings to make it more domestic. Elsewhere in the region, having said that we don't really have very many cruck frame structures in the upland areas, you can see here one in Rochdale in the upper Irwell Valley, which has a stone exterior, but is actually a cruck-framed open hall with a cruck-framed wing, large elements of which survive within that current structure. Again, dendrodating suggests that's late 15th, early 16th centuries. And this fragment of a hall in the Etherow Valley, which is just 2 cruck trusses with some of the external timber frame walls surviving and then renovated in the late 1960s, shows some of the quality of these timbers that we find in the cruck frame structures in the area. I'll come back to the carpentry techniques at the end of my talk, but there's some distinctive features around the finishing of the cruck trusses, around the apex and the yoke, which are particular styles in cruck truss design that you can see on a regional level, not just in northwest of England, but in other parts of of England and Wales, showing there's some commonality in the carpentry techniques being used. I mentioned at the beginning that I've been looking at a number of rural examples, and I wanted to talk a bit about Warburton and the cruck frame buildings from there. So for this next bit of the talk, I'm just going to look at the cruck frame buildings in the rural township of Warburton, which was in northern Cheshire but is now in Greater Manchester. It's a surviving piece of rural landscape. It's 2 kilometres in extent, and it divides very nicely into 4 quadrants. So you can see on the top left-hand corner we have a deer park. Bottom left-hand corner we have the medieval village and open fields, and then top right-hand corner an area of mossland, and bottom right-hand corner we have an area of ridgeland above the River Bolling, which forms the southern part of this township, which is hedged enclosures from the late medieval period. And the dots there represent the known cruck structures as identified by 2010, And the black dot represents the only known Cruck building in 1990. And the massive increase in the number here is because of a long-running archaeological survey that I was involved in running with the local Archaeology Society and with the University of Manchester and the University of Salford. And we were able to get into over 50 buildings in Warburton, thanks to the good offices of the people living in the rural township. And we were able to keep an eye on redevelopment as well. So not only did we get into surviving buildings, but we got in when redevelopment and reconstruction work was going on. And we even had the opportunity to excavate some of these sites as well. Out of all the known Cruck buildings there, we only lost one in the period. We've only lost one since 1990. And we had the opportunity to excavate the site after we'd recorded it. And this is the one that was demolished, Paddock Lake Farm, 18th century farmhouse on the right, double depth central staircase style farmhouse built in brick. The timber framed Cruck building is on the left, much lower, steeper pitched roof as you would expect, seemingly 1.5 stories. And then, as is very common, the partition walls. Once you strip them of the plaster, you can see the remains of the cruck-frame trusses surviving in the structure. Other buildings which we got into whilst they were being renovated included Wigsey Farm, where there was a single cruck-frame truss just to the right of the doorway. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner there. This is a building that was expanded in the 18th and again in the 19th century, and had fireplaces inserted through the middle of the cruck truss. You can see on the left, taking out much of the tie beams and removing the yoke, but leaving these fragmentary remains. We also recorded the lovely named Onion Farm, so called because it's the first farm in Warburton to grow onions in the later 19th century. It's a very peculiar building from the outside because it's initially brick and stone. You can see the stone ring at the bottom. Contains a wonderful wall painting which references the legend of St. Werburgh. And in the middle of that building, there's a fragmentary cruck-frame truss on which the wall painting is painted. And other buildings with fragmentary remains include Ditchfield Cottage here, which is also shown on this 1756 estate map in the top right hand corner, and inside you can see how fragmentary it is. We've got the stone backing for an ingle fireplace which is inserted in between the cruck truss fragments, of which you can see on the right, and then occasionally you find several cruck trusses in a barn. This is on the northern side of Warburton, which we rediscovered in 2008. You can see the chairman of the local Archaeology Society up a ladder there, busy recording the structure, still in use as a barn when we were looking at it. You can see it's been converted in the 19th century, rebuilt and extended as a brick shippen. So just to sort of wrap up on cruck frame structures in the northwest and bringing some of this data together, I talked about the carpentry techniques visible in some of these cruck frame structures where they survive with complete trusses. And one of the distinctive features of trusses is you can look at the form of the top of the truss, the apex, and Vernacular Architecture Group has characterized 7 main types of apex design in cruck trusses. You can see on the left those 7 types which we see in northwest England. There are probably another half dozen which we don't see, and we've got examples here that are common across the northwest of England. The simplest is type A, where you just have a sort of tie beam and no yoke. More rare is type G, where you have a sort of king post style upright supporting the top of the truss. But some of those examples, like F1 and F2, are not are common to Greater Manchester, but you also find them, for instance, for F1 and F2 types in southwest England, in the lower Severn Valley. and it's quite a distinct distribution. So you've got distribution of those types of apex styles in that sort of southern Welsh Marcher area, and then here in Greater Manchester and parts of Cheshire and Cheshire and Lancashire as well. Very few of these buildings have elaborate cruck-frame trusses over defining the open halls. Most of the cruck buildings we've got in Cheshire and Greater Manchester are domestic rather than agricultural. It's about a 60-40 split, but very few of them have elaborate carvings on the cruck trusses that frame the hall. Although some of them have curved timbers and spandrels which do emphasize the status of the hall, as in the sort of cruck truss at the top of this slide that's called Taunton Hall. That was dendrodated to the 15th century. There are, in Greater Manchester, there are a number of these cruck trusses with these sort of spandrel supports. We've got sort of 5 of them. They are associated with higher status buildings, freehold tenancies, and 4 of them are freehold tenancies. 1 of them is a manor, and you can see the plan form of 4 of those buildings are on the right there. And there are a number of cruck-frame buildings which are associated with manorial halls. There's about 20 out of the 97 that we know of, so they're very much in a minority. The majority of cruck-frame buildings we've recorded in Greater Manchester are farmhouses, principally, then manorial halls, and then agricultural structures. And that's a pattern we see repeated across the Fylde, across northern Cumbria, and elsewhere in Lancashire and Cheshire as well. So one of the features of these structures is therefore that if you have a cruck-frame building, you've got this 2 in 3 chance of looking at a building that predates 1600. It's also quite likely that you've got a sort of more than 50% chance that you'll be looking at a building that is a tenanted farmhouse. That makes them an indicator of earlier settlement in the region. Now, there are other indicators as well, because the cruck-frame building tradition runs alongside the box-frame tradition. They're broadly the same chronology in the region. So essentially, wherever you get these timber frame buildings, you are looking at indicators of early settlement. Although we know from the mid-17th century to the mid-18th century, there's a real boom in the agricultural population in the region, and we can see lots of new farm buildings, and particularly lots of new farmhouses being built in the area. In Greater Manchester terms, probably the number of farmhouses doubled in that 100 years. So these are really important indicators of that late medieval landscape surviving into the 17th and 18th centuries. And just to sort of finish off, these are very fragile structures. We've already seen that these buildings can survive in a very fragmentary state. This is a good example. This is Newton Hall, which was found rediscovered in 1966 in a barn next to the farm, top left-hand corner. That's the top right-hand corner is what the cruck-frame structure looked like in January 1967, when the local council were just about to demolish it. Fortunately, a local businessman came along, bought the property, and spent the next 5 years renovating it and turning it into the image in the bottom right-hand corner. But most of these cruck-frame buildings do not have a patron who can come along and do that. So they are very, very fragile. They're structures that tend to be rebuilt and hidden within the fabric of later buildings. So when we come across these elements, it's important we record them. It's important that we look at the style of the cruck trusses, the style of the apex where it survives, because that's where we're going to find most information about the carpentry techniques used to build these structures. So at which point I'm going to say thank you and I will stop sharing. And I think that was about half an hour, Doug. So
Excellent.
hopefully that was okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. That was brilliant.